Well, welcome everybody. My name is Mark Chernick, professor in the Center for Latin American Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome back to the Georgetown campus Senator Juan Manuel Galán. Senator Galán doesn't need much introduction. He's a major figure in Colombia. He's senator. He's what they call in Colombia a pre-candidate for the nomination of the Liberal Party for president. He has been playing a very interesting role in very interesting times. As you all know, Colombia has gone through a very interesting and successful peace process. Just today, the United Nations verified the I don't even know how we say this in English, they make the guns unoperable, inoperable.
Okay.
However they do that, they announced that all the weapons have been stored, they've been brought, they're now all inoperable. They will then go, of course, which was announced just in the last few days, to the Minister of Culture, where they will be, a percentage of those will be turned into monuments for peace. One in Bogota, one in Havana, one in New York at the United Nations. In this process, and this is something that I think Senator Galán will speak about, this is, for the first time, the peace process is centered on the idea and the reality of victims, that wars produce victims. And it's something you don't usually hear at negotiating tables and in implementing processes. In 2011, Colombia passed the Ley de Víctimas, a victims law, to give reparations and assistance, both individually and collectively, to victims. There's estimated there's over 8 million victims. Senator Galán is president of the commission in the Senate for victims, and he's played a major role in these discussions within the Congress, with the government, with the negotiating table when it was there. So we're delighted to welcome you back to Georgetown.
Thank you.
Senator Galán.
Thank you.
And I'll give the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's for me a pleasure to be back at Georgetown, and as you know, I'm an alumni of MSFS, 2001, 2003, with major events during those years, with the 9/11, just starting the program, and then the Sniper of Washington, and the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, major developments in foreign affairs. So it was very interesting to live those events, being a member of MSFS. And I'm also looking forward to hearing your views, your takes on what is happening in Colombia right now with this transition that we are on between this 5-decade period of conflict and war, and the effort that we're doing to build a new era for Colombia in the next few years. We've been trying to build up a process that is going to be difficult, because we need to put forward a lot of reforms that Colombia has postponed during the years under this pretext of the FARC and of the war. And now we don't have this pretext. We don't have the FARC being the excuse not to putting forward the necessary reforms that our country needs to be more equal. We are one of the most unequal countries in the whole hemisphere. I think Haiti is the only one that surpasses on inequality, and especially the rural areas compared with the urban areas are the most unfair and unequal on opportunities. And I think we just accomplished the easy part, which was to conduct these negotiations for peace. Now we're getting into the hard part, which is building the peace and winning the peace. And one of the main pillars for this peace, I think, is land reform and political participation reform. On the land reform, you have more than 60% of peasants who don't have property rights on their land. They don't have access to credit. They don't have access to technical assistance. They don't have access to social capital in terms of associations, in terms of civil society organization in the rural areas. So we need to ensure that we give these property rights to all these peasants, and that we conduct a reform on taxes imposed to land. We have a lot of cattle projects, cattle activities, economic activities in the rural areas, but it's very inefficient, and the land taxes are very low in Colombia, especially for unproductive land. And without these taxes, we cannot build a local state or state at the local level. Strong local institutions, regional institutions that can provide rule of law, that can provide services within the institutions, solutions to the people who inhabit these rural areas. And we need also to transform the relationship between the national government and the regional governments. There's a very peculiar situation in Colombia going on now, and that members from the national government from Monday to Friday travel to the regions of Colombia trying to solve problems, and the members of the regional governments, the local governments, from Monday to Friday, they come to Bogota trying to find money for their projects, funding, solutions for the problems to the regions. So it's like a reverse way of governing right now in Colombia. I mean, I think mayors and members of local governments should be at the regions trying to have enough legitimacy, enough strength to govern their communities and their territories. And the national members of government should be trying to find national solutions for the country on many, many issues that we have. Another thing that is crucial in Colombia, I think, is trying to abolish this regime of clientelism. I think corruption is like the word that everybody uses right now. It's like a la mode word for everything. But I think in the origin of corruption is clientelism. And I think clientelism has a cost, and everybody, the taxpayers, have to pay these costs. It's around 5% of the GDP, I think. And clientelism is represented on a state, on members of government, on the citizens, thinking that their relationship is through favors, is through contacts, not ensuring that rights for everybody can be enforced, but trying to get along with someone who has access to the pension system so I can get my pension. In the judiciary, this scandal that we are enduring right now of corruption in the Supreme Court the origin is clientelism, and the way they have exchanged favors between the members of the Supreme Court, other courts, and Congress, and also the executive. So I think this mentality, this culture of clientelism is one of the main problems that Colombia has to be more competitive, to have an economy that is more dynamic. In the tax legislation, this is represented, for example, on the tax exemptions. One very important industrialist from Antioquia told me that if they could invest the same amount of money in innovation and productivity that they invest on congressional lobbying to ensure that their tax exemptions are not touched, we would have a more competitive, a more productive, more innovative economy in Colombia. And it's a huge amount of money. I mean, we are talking about 30 billion pesos on tax exemptions to enterprises, and we're talking about 40 billion pesos of tax exemptions to individuals. Not all those tax exemptions are inefficient, but most of them are inefficient, and their origin is clientelism, the way they finance political campaigns, the way they put pressure on Congress to obtain these exemptions. We are working on a legislation to regulate lobbying in Colombia, and it has passed the Senate. It's now in the House of Representatives, but I think it's going to be a step forward in the right direction to regulate the activity of lobbying that doesn't have legislation in Colombia. Another topic that I think we should discuss is the narcotraffic and the increase of coca fields, the area of coca fields growing in Colombia right now, which is a hot topic right now because of the statements from President Trump last week about the certification process of Colombia, and Colombia not complying with the efforts that the US wants to see. And we're trying to build up a dialogue not only at the governmental level but at the congressional level with the US Congress and the Congress of Colombia to try to build up a different approach on drug policy and try to distinguish the policy on narcotraffic, against narcotraffic, and the policy on drugs. And try to go beyond this principle of core responsibility that we've been talking about for 30 years now. And we're like stagnant in the debate. And UNGAS produced like a pessimism. It didn't produce what we expected, that was progress in the debate and finding a new formula, a new policy on drugs. But it produced like a feeling of pessimism on the way we can improve the policy on drugs. And I've tried in Colombia to advance on these issues. For instance, we passed a legislation recognizing addiction as a disease and ensuring that the health sector can provide treatment for addicts. I was also the author of the law to regulate medical marijuana use in Colombia, and I think we have made a lot of progress on this system of regulation, to provide access to patients having cancer, having many diseases, to this substance with quality, with security, and with a price, a fair price, to provide access to these patients to this substance. That I think building up this debate could give us the result of having a different approach, especially towards the weakest links of the chain of the drug issues. And the weakest links are the consumer, the addict, the problematic user of drugs, and also the peasant who is cultivating the coca fields. And we need public health approach, human rights approach, and we need to concentrate the efforts of persecution, security, prohibition on the strongest link of the chain, which are the criminal organizations that are getting all the gains and all the money of the illicit business of drugs. And I don't think the correct policy is to spread again the coca fields. I mean, the United States, I think, the only country that they have put pressure on to reinstate the spreading of coca fields is Colombia. They tried this formula in Afghanistan for a few years, and it failed. And I think we have enough evidence, enough experience of the failure of the aerial spreading of coca fields. I mean, I think it's a very costly strategy, especially in the trust between the communities and the police force and the armed forces. We spread like 1.2 million hectares in a decade, and the only reduction we got from this spreading was like 40,000 hectares. And the years that were mostly spread, you have the statistics of the most cocaine exported towards foreign markets. So I think we need to have a new strategy, not only on alternative development and the experiments going on right now with cocoa and with coffee, but we need to have a revolution on rural roads. I mean, we have a problem of connectivity and infrastructure of the rural areas that it's the main obstacle for peasants also to have a viable way of life, to have a productive life. And building these roads is key to the security, to the connectivity of the country, especially with the efforts we have made to build the main connections between the ports and the center of the country and the Caribbean also. We need to build this rural infrastructure, public goods, increase what we have in water supply, what we have on technical assistance to cultivate the land, not only have this expansive cattle exploitation on the rural areas. So I think those are some of the challenges that we face. But I will end saying that one of the main challenges right now, immediate challenges that we're facing, is the transitional justice. And that's the heart of the peace accords. The way we implement this transitional justice is going to ensure the success or the failure of the peace accords. And this month, September, we are selecting the members of the tribunal. And next week, we're going to start the discussion of the law that implements the constitutional reform on the transitional justice. I put forward a change on the constitutional reform and on this legislation to ensure that the victims not only have access to the truth via the Truth Commission, which they will provide a general narrative, historical narrative, abstract of the 50 years of conflict to the victims. But this modification that I put forward is to ensure that the victims have access to the judicial truth that is specific, concrete, about their own case. And that is going to be a big challenge for the Transitional Tribunal on Transitional Justice. But I think it will ensure that every victim will be protected and will have a guarantee of accessing the truth and have a reparation and have also the guarantees of non-repetition and justice. And it's a big challenge. As you said, we have 8 million victims. It increased dramatically because this law of victims was designed for 4 million victims, but the Constitutional Court ordered to include all the internally displaced victims within the victims, so it increases to 8 million, the number of victims that we have to repair. We are trying to build a system of collective reparation also, to build up productive projects as a collective reparation, and not only staying with the individual reparation for each victim, because it's going to cost an enormous amount of money, and we need also to prosecute the assets of the FARC as a result of narcotraffic that I think they have internationally. I think the government has been very timid, very shy on chasing these assets, but I think it's a crucial issue not only to ensure that the victims have reparation, but to ensure that the FARC won't get unjust advantage as a political party in next elections and the way they're going to conduct politics. So I think we have to insist that the main effort of reparation has to be on the FARC, to their victims, with their assets, with the land they have. And it's very difficult to identify this land because the property rights and the tradition of the property in this land is very uncertain. But it's an effort that we need to strengthen in order to repair all these victims that are hoping for the truth, the reparation, and the guarantees of non-repetition on the areas of conflict. So I think I will end so we can start some discussion.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Senator Galán.
Thank you.
And let me start with a question, then I'll open this up. I found interesting this last discussion on transitional justice.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a question, because you put forward an idea, which is an interesting idea, that the victims, the 8 million victims, will have access not only to truth, reparation, and guarantees of no repetition,
Mm-hmm.
but also to judicial truth, justice.
Mm-hmm.
And as the courts are currently structured, as I understand it, there won't be judicial proceedings for every one of those victims.
Mhm.
The way the special jurisdiction of peace is set up is only for those who are accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The other perpetrators of crimes that don't quite rise to the level of war crimes have access to amnesty and will be amnestied. And so if the perpetrators of lesser crimes, and this is in the name of advancing peace,
Mhm.
this was set up, this is transitional justice. Only the most egregious crimes will be heard in a special court, but other crimes, the perpetrators will be amnestied. And the victims will have access to truth, reparations, but not necessarily judicial process. How do you see that? Do you envision changing that aspect, or how do you see that?
Well, without modifying the spirit of the Accords and the formula that was found for transitional justice, I think we need to be more concrete, more specific on the truth that the victims are going to get on their own case, in their own cases, and not only have like a general history of what happened in the 50-year conflict in the region, because it's the only way that every victim or every organization of victims can receive this crucial information about their cases, to go on with their lives, to go on with reconciliation. And I think we have to ensure that this specific judicial truth can be provided to the victims without transforming radically the framework that we have now with the transitional justice. That's one of the challenges that we are going to face from next week, to find this formula where the victims are more represented, more present on the proceedings of the transitional tribunal, and how the Commission of Truth can be connected to the judicial, to the tribunal, transitional justice, and with the Attorney General's office that has a lot of information about a lot of cases, especially on the people that have disappeared, which is one of the biggest problems for the victims in Colombia. Because if you sum up all the dictatorial regimes in Latin America and the disappearance that they have, Colombia has much, much more cases of disappearance, forced disappearance, that need to be resolved. We haven't resolved the victims on the Palace of Justice. 1986. There are a few cases of people that we don't know where they are yet. But with other cases, there's a lot of disappearances that are unresolved, and we need to resolve it with the mechanism of the Commission of Disappearance that is going to work with the cooperation of the UN and other instances to find out what happened with these people. But I think we're trying to build up mechanisms and procedures in order to ensure that the victims are well represented on these cases that are going to be in front of the tribunal.
Very good. So the floor is open if we have some questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Senator Galán, thank you very much for coming here. You were speaking earlier about how you believe that the Colombian government should be more aggressive in making sure that any international assets that the FARC has are reclaimed. Is there any room for that to still be done? And do you see, for example, with upcoming elections, that if they still do have these assets, that maybe they can use them to purchase votes within the country, especially with some of the more disenfranchised people within Colombia?
I think that's a real risk, and And on the discussion of the law from next week, the transitional justice, we need to, I think, put forward modification on the access to benefits to the FARC, conditioned to the declaration of these assets, this land and this money that is internationally, apparently, the money laundering system, that we need to recover to repair the victims firsthand. And then trying to find out what to do with the other assets. But I don't think the load of the reparation of the victims should be firsthand on the state, on the taxpayers, but on the people who victimized the victims. So yes, I hope that next week and in the discussion that we're going to have of the law, we can put forward some mechanisms of conditioning more strictly and enforce strictly the benefits that the FARC are going to get in terms of doing politics, in terms of having access to reduction of their term in prison or their sanctions, accordingly to the assets that they can provide to the reparation of victims. I think it's a key factor.
Senator, you mentioned
Perhaps
that
you can introduce yourself.
my name is Alan Carroll. I live here in D.C. and my wife is Colombian. Right here, Sonia.
Hi, Sonia.
That at the beginning of your talk, that you felt that the situation with the FARC had earlier been an excuse for a lack of action on various fronts that would help Colombia become a more egalitarian society. My questions are, can you explain a little bit what you meant by that?
Mm-hmm.
And related to that, do you really see political will that can open up now as a result of the peace process to undertake those kinds of reforms that you talked about?
Well, what I meant is that for 50 years we have a level of violence and internal conflict, and everybody said, no, this is the priority, we have to face this menace, this challenge, and we cannot think about any other thing that dealing with this war and this internal conflict. But now that we don't have this conflict, there's nothing that make us think about that there are other things more important that put forward these reforms, especially the main causes of the conflict, which are two: the land reform, the access to land, property rights, the use of the land, and the political participation. And in the political participation, it's very worrying right now that the political parties are so weak. And we have 28 presidential candidates trying to get citizen support, citizen signatures, in order for them to be able to participate in the campaign. Especially, we have one candidate that is being in the traditional politics, in the system, for many, many years, leader, natural leader of one of the parties, Cambio Radical, that now is getting signatures as a citizen movement, keeping this traditional party going on. So the machine of the political party, it's getting the signatures for him to be able to participate in the presidential campaign. So I think that's a very worrisome symptom of our democracy. I know this crisis of the political parties is a world crisis. It's not only Colombia. And it's the weakest link, as I think Tom Carruthers says, of the democracy. And I'm fighting within my party to be able to modernize, renovate, have internal democracy in the ways and means that the party decides, for instance, who is going to be the candidate. And it's very tough because we have a partisan elite that refuses to give way to other leaderships, to other kind of people that could participate. And my generation is in real danger of being a generation like frustrated by these partisan elites that doesn't give room to any other views. And next week is going to be a crucial week also for my party to decide if we could conduct a primary election on March, the same day of the parliamentary election, so we can get enough participation of citizens, enough votes to pick up the presidential candidate that the Liberal Party is going to endorse. Because they're trying to get back to the old practices of conventions, reunions among politicians to impose a candidate that, according to them, to the elite of the party and the machine, is the convenient candidate. So next week, Thursday and Friday, we're going to have the Congress of our party, and we're going to decide the way we go. I'm fighting for the primary. And that's very ironic because it was the same fight that my father tried 30 years ago. But the most ironic thing is not that it's the same fight. That is the fact that he fought with the same people I'm fighting now, 30 years after in the party, to give room to this primary election. So, and I think political parties are key institutions for the democracy, and if we don't recover those institutions, their legitimacy, their credibility, their trust among citizens, we can have a political context of non-institutions, of populism, of projects for an individual, not to be accountable to a party, to an idea, to an ideology. And that's a real danger right now, in my view, for the transition we are going through in Colombia to the post-conflict era.
Senator Galán, you mentioned that we need to make a reparation of the corrupt system. Now, is there a planned scheme to do so? Because I mean, Colombia has tried it before, and we have failed consistently to stop corruption. What is your proposal towards this topic?
Well, I think it has to be a fight of the whole society. Sure, the government has the biggest responsibility because it has the biggest amount of power. But this has to be a shared fight and shared responsibility. And I emphasize clientelism because I think clientelism is the origin of corruption. And the legal insecurity, the insecurity of the rule of law in Colombia, where the government and the people in power picked the winners and the losers of the economy, the winners and the losers of the health system, the winners of the losers of the educational systems, according to what contacts do you have, what people do you know to have access to opportunities, is one of the main sources of corruption right now in Colombia. And we need not only to regulate lobbying, which is a big step forward, but we need to increase the level of the public service and have excellence in public service, ethical excellence, and stimulate that the best people we can get for public service can get involved in the public service at all levels, local, regional, national level. Because right now, the best people in Colombia are not thinking about getting involved in politics or getting involved in the public sector. They're thinking about other ways of developing their careers. And I think that's a big problem, but because at the local level we have a very weak institutional system. And all the decentralization that we put forward since the 80s, with transferring more money to the regions, with the democratic election of mayors, governors, we didn't conduct the main aspect of decentralization, which was institutional decentralization. And being sure that we strengthen the local institutions with the best public servants that we can have. But everything is connected, because if you don't conduct a real fiscal reform at the local level, and you don't ensure fiscal revenues enough to build a local state strong enough, you cannot have a good public service, strong institutions at the local level. So I think those reforms have to be conducted on the same way, but the danger we have is that we get trapped on what I will call the anecdotes of the corruption, which is the scandal of the moment, and not seeing the big picture of corruption, which is clientelism. And we need to address that challenge if we want to really eradicate the roots of corruption in Colombia.
Senator Galán, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you here. And Professor Trinick, thank you so much. My name is Jeannie Michelena. I'm a first-year grad student in the Latin American Studies program. And my question for you is basically what measures are being taken in Colombia to prevent the FARC from invading Venezuela? That is an issue that's been of interest to me and of concern to me. And I'm just wondering, because I know that they are starting to, or they have been rather, starting to kind of make their way into Venezuela.
The FARC?
The FARC,
The
correct.
FARC handed in all their arms. They don't have one army.
They don't have any, but
No.
there currently
Zero.
are no.
They have no arms.
Oh.
No, if you ask that question with the ELN, that's a different question.
Oh, okay, excuse me.
But-
What I understood, they were still kind of penetrating the area of Venezuela.
No,
and I
the
wanted
FARC
to
has
know.
handed in every last arm. Yeah, there's peace process.
Well, right, no, I know, but okay, well, good.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to know what was.
Well, you
being
might
done
want,
for them.
there is an interesting question there actually around the ELN, which is, there's another group in Colombia, which is the National Liberation Army, Ejército de Liberación Nacional. They currently are in talks with the government, just as the FARC was. Their talks are in Quito,
In Ecuador.
in Ecuador. I I invited actually a former ELN member to our class at the University of Los Andes this summer. And one of the scenarios he said, the worst case scenario is that they don't get a peace agreement between the government and the ELN. And that the ELN has very strong roots in Venezuela. And if Venezuela breaks down, he could imagine the worst case scenario and a scenario where peace fails in Colombia, that the ELN could recreate themselves as an internationalist guerrilla inside Venezuela. I don't know if you've heard anything like that, Senator Galán. I don't think that's likely, but it's the worst case scenario. Those who support peace in Colombia should support, I would say, success for the peace talks in Quito. But if that all breaks down, and it's very difficult, there's a ceasefire going on, which was put into, which was agreed to at the eve of the visit of the Pope. So, but I think that's the question. But the FARC's out of the question in the sense that they're no longer an armed group. Yeah. No.
Not knowing that specific
Yeah.
Still learning.
No, I think one of the biggest threats of the peace process with the FARC is the ELN, because some dissidents also from the FARC, or all members of the FARC, are trying to recycle within the ELN. And that's why the peace process with the ELN is so important to ensure the success of the peace process with the FARC. I mean, both peace processes are connected. And the ELN has a lot of activity beyond the border in Venezuela. And it's a very difficult negotiations because the ELN is more dogmatic, and there are also questions about the ability of the negotiators in Quito to have command and control on the whole ELN. I mean, with the FARC, I don't know, you had like 80% members of the FARC represented in La Habana with the negotiators and the members of the secretariat. But with the ELN, it's less evident, this command and control that they have with all the fronts. So, yes, I had my doubts about the ceasefire, because I think a good formula with the FARC was the ceasefire for the end of the negotiation, because the military pressure, I think, was useful till the end of the negotiations to put pressure on the FARC to go on, and the times of negotiations and the dynamic of the negotiation. And I think with the ELN was the same, but I don't have all the information as the negotiators have and the government has to declare this ceasefire at this stage of the negotiation. But yes, I think both peace processes are connected, and the success of one peace process is connected to the other.
Well, hello, Senator Gala.
Hi.
My name is Juliana, and I am a graduate here at Georgetown from Barranquilla. It's a great honor to have you here, and my question was actually about clientelism. So, as a student here, I've seen how a lot of the issues we have in our country, and I would dare to say even our region, are very socially embedded within our societies. And I just wanted to ask you, in your experience or your opinion, what policies or mechanisms do you propose to kind of bring awareness and kind of start talking more about clientelism? Because I think it's a problem that we know it's there, but we don't really talk about it. And as a lot of like you said, the partisan elite kind of benefits or is really involved with it. It's an issue that is there, but it's not giving, it's not publicly discussed or attempted. So I just wanted to ask you, what do you think we should do to kind of start talking about the issue more and giving it the importance it deserves?
Well, I'm trying to raise the issue as an issue of the campaign, for the campaign, because because of the scandals of corruption, all the candidates are forced to speak about corruption. But if we want to go beyond the problem, we need to speak about the clientelism. And basically, what I'm trying to use as a formula to raise awareness is to talk about a society of favors. Who is favoring me and my interest, and to change that culture of favor to a culture of rights. So the state, the public institutions are there to ensure that the rights of all citizens are enforced, are guaranteed. Not my particular favor because I know someone in this hospital that is going to help me get a bed for my mom that is sick, or someone who is in this university that can help me get into the program of university, of someone who works in the public pension system that is going to help me get my pension. That change of culture is completely necessary if we want to build a new society, more equal society with inclusive growth, economic growth. If we want to be more competitive, more productive, more innovative, we need that change because it's one of the biggest obstacles and problems that we have for the post-conflict Colombia.
Senator, I'm Colombian. I work at Georgetown. And I actually, in terms of like the corruption topic, I wanted to address mostly the problem in the coast. Because as we know, in recent elections, the coast has given, for example, the current president, I'd say enough winning votes, and that's actually the fear that this time we have in terms of the votes and how many of those votes are going to be, let's say, given to Vargas Lleras because of the housing benefits that he provided to the coast part. So that's one of the questions. What is your take on it, and how can they address that problem? Because it's not only about bringing change and bringing more about the presence of the state. I will say that it will be more about a generational change too, because in the coast it's like a very let's say like a very big problem. And then the second, there are some concerns about the implementation of the peace process, even from like actually the implementers on the ground. There are seeing concerns that basically FARC members were given cedulas and bank accounts, and there's no control or there's no following up with these members. So basically, for the follow-up and for the reparation and for the the assistance, there's no really a heavy control, and there's actually a lot of concern, not only from like the Colombian population, but also from international organizations on this sense. So I wanted to know also your take on it.
Well, for my last campaign to the Senate, I remember I organized a few focus groups in the country to know better what people were thinking about the party, about many other issues. And in the coast, what struck me was that we conducted a focus group with university students. And these university students were talking about selling their vote. So if you get these responses at that level of education, I mean, that worries me a lot. And I think we have to put in place a system also to ensure that whistleblowers would be protected. There's a system to protect the people who signals these abuses and this corruption. Because in Colombia, there's a culture of persecuting the people who is a whistleblower, no? And also a system of intelligence to follow up the money in the political campaigns, especially cash money, which is one of the biggest and hardest parts of ensuring that there is transparency in the financial system of a political campaign, of the political parties. And also facilitate legal financing. Because I think legal financing from the banking system is quite difficult for political candidates, especially new candidates, young candidates. Because to get a loan for a campaign, it's a nightmare in Colombia. I mean, you go to a bank and they put you from committee to committee to committee to study your loan. And sometimes when you get a loan, it's too late for the campaign. So I think this has to be in two ways. I mean, to prosecute the illegal financing of the campaigns, but to facilitate also the legal framework to have access to funds through the financial system, through the banks, to finance the political campaigns, the political parties, with maybe public financing of the campaigns that would ensure more transparency on the financing of congressional campaigns. And on the implementation question, I'm not sure of the details about the following up of these dangers of abuse, but I think the system of the law on victims and the new system of the transitional justice and the commission of truth have to be coherent with each other to ensure also and to enforce all these risks that you mentioned are not real risks, but could be minimized and could be acted upon on due time. Because we have like a lot of institutions that right now are dealing with the peace process, but the main challenge is that these institutions act in a coherent manner, coordinated with each other, to respond quickly to any risk or any danger that could appear in the implementation.
I want to touch on a topic that you mentioned, and it's the modernization of the country.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how do you believe the Colombian public will appreciate your stance on same-sex marriage and the liberalization of drugs?
Well, on the marijuana issue, I think we did a huge step forward. And I've been talking also about coca and the medicinal and nutritional use of coca, and put forward a legislation on that. That's risky in a campaign, I know, but I've been thinking about that for a long time. And the marijuana issue was very, very tough. And I remember the day we voted at the Senate. Let me tell you an anecdote about that. I went to the Catholic Church to have some support for the legislation. And the cardinal from Bogota said to me, you have to go to the Cardinal Pimiento in Santander, which is 97 years old, because he's the most conservative cardinal we have on many issues, like gay marriage, but he's most liberal on drug issues. So you have to address him. So I went to Bucaramanga, I visited him, and he said, well, send me the legislation project to my email, and I will study it. So I said, okay. I sent the project, and 6 months passed on because Uribe and the conservatives blocked the vote on the legislation. And the date we were going to vote, I called him and I said to him, well, I think it's now or never. I need your statement on the project. And W Radio and Julio Sánchez Cristo called him, interviewed him, and I was like expecting what he said. And he said, well, marijuana is a gift of God. It depends how men use this gift, for good, for bad. And I showed this statement to the senators, the conservative senators, and one of the conservative senators, Juan Manuel Corso, stayed for the vote and voted in favor. And that vote saved the legislation. So it was very narrow, very, very narrow. But I think this legislation, and now that we have a decree, that we have resolutions on licensing, that we have studied the model of Colorado, Uruguay, Israel, Holland, Canada, is now recognized as a very good framework, legal framework for medical marijuana. And I think that's going to be a step in the right direction of changing the culture, of changing the approach on illicit drugs, and having also the doctors involved on studying the effects of marijuana and on the health. But on the other issues, we had a difference with one of the members of the party, Vivian Morales, who was putting forward a referendum in order to prohibit gay couples to adopt children, but also single moms or single parents to adopt children. And the nature of the Colombian family is not mom and dad. I mean, it's this extensive family with grandparents involved, with cousins involved, with aunts, uncles. And also, I mean, we had an internal debate in the Liberal Party because these religious views on family, trying to impose these religious views, I mean, goes against all the principles that I think the Liberal Party should stand for and defend. And well, I try to be coherent with my liberal views, the Liberal Party, and try to put forward issues that the conservative doesn't want to address. So I don't know how it's going to play out in the campaign, but I hope people realize that I've been trying to be coherent.
Last question. In recent days, President Trump said that he was thinking about decertifying Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
If the reduction of the cocoa crops was not done well, or it was not reduced. I lived in Colombia through the 90s, and I remember the decertifying process that we had and the crisis that caused. So what is your take on what President Trump has said, and what do you think that the Colombian government do to address the situation?
Well, we're trying to build some ways of communicating with Congress, the US Congress. And I just went out from a meeting with Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS, and we're trying to set up a more institutional, official framework of meeting between Colombian Congress and the US Congress, trying to build up an agenda, trying to share information, views, new formulas on drug policy, and not going back like 30 years, starting to talk about again aerial spreading of crops. Things that there's enough evidence and enough experience that they're failures. So if we want to get new results, we need to try new formulas, new policies, new ideas. But this communication with the US Congress is very difficult. You have sporadic trips from senators and members of the House here that go to Colombia, but they're like in a capsule going around the country, and they go back to Washington. And I think we need a more institutional and official and formal framework of having encounters with members of Congress here, so we don't have this relationship only between the government of Colombia, President Trump, and the Congress, but the Colombian Congress, members of the Colombian Congress. And Secretary Almagro said that he's very, very convinced that it's a good idea, and that in the next few months we're going to have this meeting between members of the Colombian Congress, members of the US Congress, and try to put on the table the evidence, the experience, and try to find new ways, new formulas for policy, especially with the epidemic of consumption here in the US, with prescription drugs, with opiates, and the 35,000 people killed for overdoses with prescription drugs here in the US. And we have also a problem of consumption. This line that we used to draw separating countries that were specialized on production and countries that were specialized on consumption is not realistic line anymore. In Colombia we have a problem of consumption. Here they also have production of illegal drugs. So we need to share views and to address prevention with policies. Not the DARE program. I don't know if you know the DARE program from the Los Angeles police in schools. We need to address the issue of having the professors and teachers, the elementary schools, high schools, well qualified to address the problems of consumption, of abuse, retarding the first use, which is key in order to prevent. All these issues, more sophisticated and that go beyond this rhetoric of co-responsibility, and we have to go beyond that with specific measures that we can take with each other, both countries. And I think they have a parliamentary group with Mexico, but it's been like 2 years since this parliamentary group hasn't met. And so I'm hoping, and that's the meetings that I have these 2 days with the US Congress, that we can accomplish this framework to meet with these members of Congress and build up an agenda on drug policy and policy against narco traffic.
I think we'll end it there. I want to thank you so much,
No,
Senator Galán.
thank you.
That was wonderful.
I enjoyed it very much.
We did too. It's a great privilege for you to come back to Georgetown anytime. Good
Thank
luck in
you.
the campaign.
Thank you.
Keep us informed.
Of course.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.